Okay, well, welcome back to the Penn Workshop in the History of Material Text. Great to see so many of you again and some new faces. I'm Zach Lesser. I'm a professor in the English department, and I co-organize the workshop along with Jerry Singerman from the Penn Press.
So welcome, everybody.
And John Pollack, who will be logging on soon, but is not here yet, I think, for personal reasons. He is in the Kislak Center. And our graduate fellow, the Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, Philip Mogan.
Hi, everyone.
So we are...
Wait, you're forgetting somebody, Zach.
I am?
Yeah, he's in the lower left-hand corner of my screen. He without whom we would not be here.
Oh, you're talking... Yeah, I didn't see Peter here. Oh, yeah. He's not in the lower left corner. Peter Stallybrass, who's our founding... I can't remember what title we invented for you. Founding director or director emeritus of the workshop.
Hi, everybody.
Peter founded the workshop 29 years ago, I believe. So this is 29 years of weekly meetings. And as always, I encourage you to check out our website, pennmaterialtext.org, which has a searchable database of past talks going back, I think, for 24 or so of those 29 years. We couldn't find the data for the earliest years. And also the schedule of this semester's talks, which have been great so far and look like they'll continue to be really interesting. You also can find a link there to our YouTube channel where we have talks, recordings of all the talks this year. And you can sign up for our listserv to get weekly announcements of the upcoming talks. Just as always, a reminder, you can use the raise hand function. You can use it at any time. So even if you want to put it up during the talk, if you think of a question that you don't want to forget that you have, this will help us moderate easily at the end, and we always have an extended discussion. If for some reason you don't see the raise hand function, or for whatever reason, you can ask your question in the chat and I'll try to pull it out of there. So I'm really pleased to welcome Jean Lee Cole to speak this evening. She is professor of English at Loyola University in Maryland, where she also founded the American Studies minor and serves as its program director. And she's long been interested in material text. Before she became a professor, she worked as a graphic designer, a book and magazine typesetter and editor. And she has a special interest in periodicals. She's been the editor of the journal American Periodicals until 2 months ago, and has been president of the Research Society for American Periodicals. She's the author of How the Other Half Laughs, The Comic Sensibility in American Culture, 1895 to 1920, and is currently working on a new project that I think takes up a strand of that research, investigating the relationship between the comic strip and early 20th century American fiction, especially in relationship to questions of race, ethnicity, and immigration. She's also an accomplished editor, including editions of work by Winifred Eaton and Zora Neale Hurston, as well as the Civil War correspondence of Henry McNeill Turner, and texts associated with the Women's Literary Club of Baltimore, which she co-edited with her undergraduate students. Tonight, she'll talk about Repulsive Women, Djuna Barnes, and others in the American Periodical Press, 1900 to 1915. So please light up your digital clapping hands to welcome her with me.
Thank you for that warm welcome. It's really great to see some familiar names and faces in the audience. And I have to say that, first of all, I'm very grateful to be invited and honored to be invited to this forum. And I'm also absolutely embarrassed that I've never been to one of these talks. So I have to apologize for that, but I'm glad to finally be here. So I am actually going to drop into the chat a link to a PDF version of slides that I'll be talking about today. That way, some of you may want to actually look at the slides as I'm talking about them, because I think on the screen share, it won't be possible to actually see all the details that you might want to. So I'm going to share my screen now, God willing, and we can get started. So yeah, as Zach said, the title of my talk tonight is Repulsive Women, Djuna Barnes and Others in the American Periodical Press, 1900 to 1915. This is mostly new research for me, and And as a caveat, I just want to say that with COVID-19, I had to do all this research without access to archives. And so that was kind of an interesting challenge. And we can talk about that during the Q&A. Comic art had appeared in newspapers and magazines in the United States since at least the 18th century, and by the turn of the 20th century, a range of distinct subgenres of comic newspaper art could be identified. For example, the single panel political cartoon or non-political cartoon, as shown here, exemplified by Thomas Nast at Harper's Weekly. The single panel situational comic, often captioned with a joke, seen here in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which will feature in today's discussion, and the multi-panel comic strip, which frequently appeared in its two-line form on the sports pages, in a four-panel form, sorry, on the sports pages of the weekday edition, and in half or full-page form in the Color Sunday Comic Supplement, AKA the Funnies. These definitively lowbrow cultural productions have long been considered anathema to the aesthetic aspirations of modernism. The experimental fiction of Djuna Barnes in particular seems radically removed from the world of comic art. Yes, it is true that she launched her career from the bowels of yellow journalism, working as a staff writer and artist for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle and the New York Press, among others, and interviewing celebrities for the New York World. But these activities are frequently dismissed as byproducts of a youthful, if unseemly, liking for mass culture. Barnes, after all, was just a teenager at the time and clearly was awed by the hustle and bustle of New York's street scene and celebrity culture. Others rationalize her early career as hack work done simply to ingratiate herself in New York's social intellectual scene or to pay the bills. Daniela Caselli, for example, argues that Barnes's early career in journalism and illustration has been overlooked by scholars because they've seen it as, quote, too simple or inadequate to deserve interpretation, end quote. Barnes's biographer, Philip Herring, writes that these works simply, quote, gave readers what they wanted, end quote. The fact remains, however, that Barnes was not the only modern woman with artistic aspirations to plunge into the murky world of newsprint. And the fact that she gave readers what they wanted indicates as much her ability to characterize modern subjectivities in these forms, as well as in her more experimental fiction. Barnes engaged with the early 20th century cultural scene in different ways. For a writer so given to the forms and expressions of the past and known for impenetrable diction and syntax, that engagement was sensual and frequently, literally, an engagement of the body. Her best-known piece of journalism, How It Feels to Be Forcibly Fed, was accompanied with by a series of lurid photos of the strikingly attractive young Barnes being strapped to the operating table and subjected to force feeding, a practice employed on recalcitrant suffragettes who embarked on hunger strikes in prison. Her interviews focused on dancers, actors, and celebrities, portraying them in real life, as they say, in backstage dressing rooms or at home on deshabille. As discordant as these activities might be with the rest of Barnes's career, in and of themselves, they were not unusual. Her work very clearly follows in the footsteps of other enterprising women artists who emerged during the first decade of the 20th century. Here, I will place Barnes's early productions alongside the work of two of these women. Marjorie Organ was almost certainly the first female staff comic strip artist at William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal, and also was a student and later wife of the Ashcan School painter, Robert Henry. Kate Carew was also a comic strip artist, but better known as a caricaturist and celebrity interviewer for both The World and the New York Tribune. The works of these and other early female comics artists lay the groundwork for Barnes's depictions of the grotesque transformations of bodies, especially female ones, that were seemingly required by patriarchal modernity. Marjorie Organ was born in 1886 in Ireland and immigrated to the United States in her early teens. At the age of 14, she took up what I guess I would call an apprenticeship with cartoonist Dan McCarthy, whose complex full-page cartoons frequently grace the front page of the comic section of Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. When she was only 16, she was hired at Hearst's New York Journal, the world's most significant rival. The art department of the journal at this time was no place for ladies. The artist occupied the 8th floor of the Rhinelander building, a former grain warehouse dating from the early years of the 19th century. Filled with smoke from cigars, pipes, and cigarettes, the artists were located immediately below the linotype room, which spewed molten lead that dripped through the cracks between the floorboards. The picture shown here is of the world's linotype room rather than the journals, which I was not able to find for this talk, but I think it should give you a good idea. Michael Tisserand described the scene in the art department in his biography of George Harriman, who created his strip Crazy Cat at the Journal just a few years later under the same conditions. Tisserand writes, "They worked in a filthy room stuffed with desks and tables. Many mornings, the floor was littered with old bottles of bromo seltzer. Panties hung in the windows instead of curtains. There's no fun in such things," editor Arthur Brisbane had objected. "No, the fun has been taken out of them," replied cartoonist T.E. Powers. Organ either must have relished working under these conditions despite all expectations, or she endured them with great forbearance. For nearly 4 years, she produced both daily and Sunday strips that appeared in the journal and nationwide through the Hearst newspaper syndicate. Organ's strips highlighted the anxious conventionality of modern men and women and the means by which patriarchy transformed women into grotesques. In the appropriately titled strip, The Wrangel Sisters, for example, she depicted the perfectly coiffed, stylishly dressed sisters, Jess and Bess, engaging in petty, unseemly behavior, usually in the process of competing for a man's affections. Here, the sisters wrangle with one another over who is taking up too much room under Mr. Brown's umbrella, resulting in the drenching of all parties concerned. Organ's exaggeration of bosom and bustle exemplified the distortions wrought by modernity on female behavior. In her most pointedly critical strip, Strange What a Difference a Mere Man Makes, from 1905, Organ depicts women who, as she put it in one installment, quote, distort themselves out of all semblance to human beings the moment a mere man appears. The repeating gag was to depict a group of women who become transformed into a ridiculous, undifferentiated mass at the appearance of an attractive man on the scene. Their unified group posture, learned one assumes from the pages of magazines and from advertisements, grotesquely exaggerates female physiological markers, breasts, buttocks, and lips that ostensibly would attract the male target. In this example, topical, I chose it just for this occasion, the herd of women object most strenuously to receiving a vaccine from a female physician, but are all too willing to roll up their sleeves and subject their bare arms to the needle when a dashing male doctor is sent around. Organ left the chaos of the Rhinelander offices by the beginning of 1906. By that time, she had taken up painting under the instruction of Robert Henry, leader of the so-called Ashcan School painters, whom she married in 1910. A talented painter in her own right, she exhibited at the 1913 Armory Show, but she eventually became better known as Henry's model, appearing with her striking red hair and strawberries and cream complexion in paintings such as Lady in Black with Scarf, which presented her as glamorous and desirable, both a model of modern womanhood and tightly controlled under the male gaze. As a model, usually clothed, but sometimes not, she is subsumed in what art historian Griselda Pollock describes as the sites of sexual exchange, quote, across which men artists claim their modernity and compete for leadership of the avant-garde, unquote. Places like cafes, brothels, and artist studios. Pollock argues that modernist women painters, such as Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt, depicted alternate spaces, kitchens, dining rooms, gardens, that privileged women's roles as caretakers, household managers, and friends over their role as sex partners. The paintings and drawings that survive from Marjorie Organ, however, show Organ's appropriation and inversion of the male gaze. Here, she humorously depicts her husband's rude awakening the morning after. It's not clear if the young Djuna Barnes was familiar with Organ's work, but nevertheless, Organ established an important precedent for the drawings and cartoons that Barnes would later produce for some of the same newspapers. Kate Carew, born in 1869, was a much more obvious model for Barnes. Born in Oakland, California, just a few years after the conclusion of the Civil War, she attended the San Francisco School of Design, where her work came under the eyes of Ambrose Bierce. Bierce got her a place at the San Francisco Examiner in 1889, and a decade later, in 1900, she relocated to New York City and published her first caricature in Joseph Pulitzer's New York World on September 15th of that year. This was the start of a long and prolific career as a caricaturist, comic strip artist, and celebrity interviewer on both sides of the Atlantic. Carew interviewed figures including Mark Twain, William Butler Yeats, and Sarah Bernhardt in a snappy yet self-deprecatory style. She also displayed a consistent visual brand in her interview features, picturing herself with huge owlish glasses, an enormous wide-brimmed hat with a question mark-shaped ostrich feather perched on top, and a large portfolio in which she ostensibly took down copious notes and visual impressions that she transformed into her full-page feature interviews. To give you an example of her writing style, I will quote at some length from an interview of actor and playwright Charles Rand Kennedy from 1912, the year Barnes arrived in New York. The quoted portion is outlined in red on the slide to give you a sense of how extensive these interviews were. Outside, it rained cats and dogs. Inside, it soon began to rain words, sentences, phrases, paragraphs, books, libraries, the British museums. Sometimes they spluttered, sometimes splashed, sometimes merely rippled. Beside his Niagara of eloquence, the thin, purling line of talk of the usual interview is as a tiny brook to a mighty river, bred in mountain fastnesses, fed by roaring streams, bursting all limitations of space and strength. My editor had suggested socialism as a topic. I intended to begin with the Old Testament patriarchal system, steeplechase through the early and Middle Ages, down to our troublous times, where coal and wood, butter and eggs, spring lamb, and green peas and strikes are of daily occurrence, the result of a heinous economic system which either should or should not be abolished. I thought we would decide this in the interview. There was not a moment granted me to tell what I knew about the system of Karl Marx, Fourier, John Stuart Mill, Plato, H.G. Wells, Ricardo. Actually, I didn't even have a second to say that no man who designed such a lovely easy chair as did William Morris could be wrong in his political views. I hope you enjoyed that. I like it. In all of Carew's interviews, she and her engagement and negotiations with her subject are as much the attraction as the prospect of learning titillating details about a celebrity's private life. In this particular case, Carew puts her own witty volubility in competition with Kennedy's, whose voice in the end will dominate the page. In the long run, Carew graciously acquiesces to her subject, but not without demonstrating that she does so very much by choice, not weakness. Carew also published a semi-regular comic strip called The Angel Child, which was published in the World's Sunday Comic Supplement at roughly the same time that Marjorie Organ was publishing The Wrangle Sisters and Strange What Difference a Mere Man Makes in the journal. In Carew's strip, an oversized toddler unwittingly terrorizes the rest of her family, especially her mother, revealing the grotesque realities of modern family life that contrasted with more customarily sentimental depictions of maternal love. Published in one of New York's largest newspapers, Carew became known as, quote, the world's caricaturist, unquote, in both senses of the word. Her interviews and comic strips, like the work of her colleague R.F. Outcall, creator of the Yellow Kid comic strip, were proprietary to the world, but also became known worldwide. In 1911, she was lured away from the world to London, where her interviews appeared in publications including The Tatler, as well as continuing to publish stateside under the masthead of the New York Tribune. Carew almost certainly was a model for Barnes when she was brought on board the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1913. Like Carew and other female journalists of the day, Barnes was hired as much for the fact that she was a woman as she was for her qualifications as either an artist or journalist. Hiring an attractive young woman to engage in the world of rough and tumble yellow journalism created endless opportunities to tantalize readers with voyeuristic accounts of scenes otherwise barred from upstanding members of the female sex: betting parlors, sporting events, jails, force feeding tables, even court proceedings and political rallies. Barnes's work was featured on the sports or sporting pages assigned to cover local events such as football games and bicycle races. She also produced a newspaper comic called Types Found in Odd Corners Roundabout Brooklyn, visible in the bottom right corner of the slide. A dozen or so installment of Types appeared in the weekday paper in the latter half of 1913 on the front page of the feature section, which was rather cheekily subtitled alternately Pictures and Sporting or Pictures and Sermons. The comic always appeared in one of the bottom corners of the page. Underneath, an image-dominated feature that frequently highlighted local goings-on in Brooklyn with photographs supplied by the Eagle's readers, current events from the viewpoint of the cartoonists, and so on. Other elements of the front page included regular columns by Eagle staff members, society news items, political and historical commentary, jokes, and squibs. Subsequent pages of the section contained sports news, advertisements, and the women's page with domestic advice and the latest fashions. This front page always featured some kind of image in the bottom corners, and these frequently included single panel newspaper comics, as we see in the November 12th issue, which is in the center of the slide. And the cartoon is the one that was in the second slide of the presentation. This indicates that the Daily Eagle's editor classified Types as being generically aligned with the comics. Granted, not all of Barnes's portraits were humorous. In Tomorrow Assured, on the one hand, a rather windblown looking man is depicted with arms full of books and packages of bread, intimating that despite the buffets of fortune, he has all he really needs for sustenance. On the other hand, The Pay from July 28th, 1913, depicts a raggedly dressed woman, her face downcast and obscured by an unkempt dark mass of hair with hand outstretched as if seeking alms or perhaps payment for illicit services rendered. Yet taken as a whole, the impression given by Types is that of a critical but loving observer of Brooklyn's street life. Their placement in this section of the Eagle and the generally comic tone of the surrounding elements indicates that the Daily's editorship, as well as the newspaper's readership, read Types Found Roundabout in Odd Corners as a comic feature, and that is how I would classify it. Barnes eventually found her métier, at least during this early period, as a celebrity interviewer and as a stunt girl reporter in the mold of Nellie Bly, subjecting herself to force feeding, as we have already seen, as well as allowing herself to dangle from a building, to be rescued by firemen using different methods, or by playing with a baby gorilla. In her own interview of Charles Rand Kennedy, which appeared in the New York Press, Barnes also noted Kennedy's penchant for eloquence, as well as her own. Kennedy is human, even terribly human, she writes. Sometimes reaching for an epigram, he picks a plum. Sometimes reaching for a plum, his wide, sweeping hands grow amazed at the emptiness. And yet Kennedy says things. Barnes is amused, but also like Carew, is blithely and unintimidated by this man of many words. She writes, quote, "It is the usual and natural thing, the cornering of a man, the pelting with impertinent questions, of going away and telling the world that he raises his feet and rests them easily upon the fender of fame, that he reaches over and plucks rose leaves for the filling of his pipe. To say that when he smiles, he lays bare a white, quivering ultra personality. And easy too, it is to say, that he is an all-around good-tempered, good-looking fellow, which same no one on this earth is wholly and gets away with it." It could be argued that Barnes's imagery is less conventional, her diction more startling than Carew's. For one, Alice Berry, who edited Barnes's interviews for publication in the 1980s, remarked upon, quote, the fantastical statements and musings that resound strikingly off the air and so often off the soul as well, unquote. This retroactive view, of course, would have been inaccessible to Barnes's readers, and it is more likely than not that they saw Barnes as being of a piece with Carew. If Carew was the world's caricaturist and interviewer, Barnes became the New York Press's, publishing an interview about once every other week between December 1913 and August 1914. Over the next decade and a half, she published dozens of interviews in the press, the New York Morning Telegraph, the New York Sun, and the New York Tribune, in their Sunday magazines, as well as magazines such as Theater Guild and The Dial. The pandemic has prevented me from examining copies of many of these publications, but I was able to locate this example of an interview of Alfred Stieglitz appearing in the New York Morning Telegraph Sunday magazine in 1917. She interviewed both international and local celebrities, including Lillian Russell, Mother Jones, Flo Ziegfeld, Billy Sunday, and Diamond Jim Brady. From the beginning, though, she loved to interview actors and dancers. She was especially fascinated by the tango, a dance that took both Europe and the United States by storm in the 1910s. References to tango appear throughout her work during this time. An exotic, aggressive, probably exhilaratingly improper dance form, tango provided a distinct contrast to the sleek, streamlined, coolly impenetrable forms of modern femininity exemplified in Barnes's Nightwood character, Nora Vogt. The audaciously physical dimension of the dance, as Christina Kohler has described it, clearly appealed to the sexually adventurous Barnes. In one of her first short stories, The Terrible Peacock, which was published a few months after the Charles Rand Kennedy interview in the All-Story Cavalier Weekly story paper in October of 1914, she described one such dancer as, quote, light and sinuous as a wreath of green mist, the very poetry of motion, wearing a close-fitting silken dress that undulated like troubled, weed-filled water as she moved, unquote. Movement, fluidity, and sexual and social transgression unified all of her work from the period, regardless of where it was published. Here you can see at a glance a figural treatment that emphasizes the fleshy irregularities and idiosyncrasies of the human figure. Elsewhere, as in the Stieglitz piece shown in the previous slide, she uses a more stylized pen and ink technique that uses negative space and cubist refractions of form to muddle the boundaries between figure and ground, between people, between identities. Daniela Caselli writes that even Barnes's early work is governed by a, quote, still unacknowledged poetics of impropriety that would eventually permeate all aspects of her work and her figure as a modernist author, unquote. This poetics of impropriety was not the purview of Barnes alone. While her work may have appeared in a wider range of publication forms, the work of all three women I have treated here, Barnes, Carew, and Organ, are consistent with a mode I describe elsewhere as the comic grotesque, the use of caricature, exaggeration, and depictions of the grotesque and even the repulsive to elicit sympathetic common feeling. It is a modern form of the old Bakhtinian carnivalesque, where class, gender, and racial identities are reversed and masqueraded as a salutary social practice, a way of engaging in or displaying chaos and anarchy as a recognition of shared frustration or shared desire. As one manifestation of a more general mode that I describe as the comic sensibility, the comic grotesque has some similarities to what Lisa Mendelman has recently called modern sentimentalism. Like modern sentimentalism, the comic sensibility engages, quote, quoting Mendelman here, feeling both corporeal sensation and emotional intuition as an essential source of knowledge, meaning, and interpersonal connection, unquote. It uses irony, quote, to generate affiliation with and belonging to various collectives by exposing or connecting the author's and reader's shared intuitive knowledge, unquote. Modern sentimentalism, however, mutes those feelings or suppresses them under the guise of modernist disaffection. The comic sensibility, in contrast, seeks to provide outlets for those feelings by engaging the excesses of grotesquerie. The almost embarrassed acknowledgement of Barnes within the canon of modernism is due in large part to her embrace of the grotesque. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Barnes's first book publication, The Book of Repulsive Women. Quote, "If one truly cared for Djuna Barnes, one would say very little indeed about the Book of Repulsive Women," unquote, writes biographer Herring, who nevertheless goes on to describe it as disgusting, portraying lesbianism in the most horribly negative terms imaginable, and life in general as a dirty, mean trick. Herring really does not like this book. Barnes herself disavowed this production later in her life, refusing to give permission for its republication, leaving it out of her vita and list of publications, and referring to it throughout the remainder of her life simply as, quote, "that book of repulsive women," uncapitalized and untitled. Melissa J. Hardy writes that it was a book that, quote, "Barnes specifically wished to repress within her writing career," unquote. Yet in many ways, it constitutes Barnes's most direct expression of the comic grotesque, merging the forms of popular sentimental poetry and modern advertising style with the more discomfiting aspects of modern womanhood. The book, published in Guido Bruno's chapbooks series, consists of 8 poems or rhythms, followed by 5 black and white ink drawings, which verge on cartoons. Barnes scholars have noticed that Bruno, here and in his other publications, quote, "insists on positioning Barnes's artistic output in terms of decadent aesthetics." For example, he credited her drawing the spring, the poet, the flower, seen in the previous slide, to, quote, "Djuna Barnes, the American Beardsley," unquote, and published it alongside a poem by Charles Baudelaire. It's not clear in the case of the Book of Repulsive Women if Barnes intended the 5 drawings to illustrate the poems, or if she intended them to be published in separate sections as Bruno produced them. Later editors, including Douglas Messerly, have rearranged the poems and drawings to appear together. As you can see in this slide, there are clear correspondences between some of the drawings and poems, even though they do not appear together. A woman and jar appearing in the 3rd poem and the 2nd drawing, a naked woman with bulging belly in the 1st poem and 3rd drawing, and a poem and drawing depicting a cabaret dancer. As far as I know, Barnes never explained what her plan was for the book. Nevertheless, that they appeared together in one volume called a chapbook, a form that historically reproduced woodcuts and other prints alongside ballads and other short texts, the publication cultivates the expectation in the reader that the two should be read in concert, even if the drawings are not intended to illustrate the poetry per se. Megan Fox writes that Barnes's book, quote, "exposes the denigration of women's bodies and forms of expression that appears within Western philosophy and the literary canon by inverting these representations, transvaluing dominant accounts of perversity, and endorsing forms of radical alterity," unquote. Adopting the disguise of formal sentimental verse, Barnes exposes the grotesque realities of modern female existence, ranging from the cabaret singer to the streetwalker to the suicide. The poems present an odd combination of clinical distance and empathy. The contrast is most noticeable in the last of the 8 poems reproduced here. Suicide. Corpse A in the 1st stanza is tenderly described as, quote, "a shattered small cocoon with a little bruised body like a startled moon, and all the subtle symphonies of her a twilight rune." Corpse B, in contrast, lays on the coroner's slab, quote, like some small mug of beer gone flat," unquote. The 4th drawing, meanwhile, depicts a pale, corpse-like figure hovering, perhaps moon-like, over an array of ambiguous, murky ones, The man on the left with the Fu Manchu mustache evokes Oriental exoticism, or perhaps the oblivion of opium, while the androgynous central figure gestures either hopelessly or helplessly. Appendages, or possibly tree branches or animals, enter from either side of the image, which is framed under a proscenium arch or perhaps a window frame into the mind's eye. Both image and poem present darkly evocative scenes that are also not without an element of the absurd or ridiculous. To describe the body of a suicide victim as a small mug of beer gone flat, and to have these lines be the end of the book itself, transgresses the boundaries of good taste and perhaps good poetry. To assert such an image as poetic was artistic risk-taking, to say the least. But what emerges most strongly in the book of Repulsive Women is that being a modern woman, a woman in modernity, was risky in and of itself. In the third poem, Seen from the L, Barnes writes, "Still, her clothing is less risky than her body in its prime. Though her lips are vague as fancy, in her youth, they bloom vivid and repulsive as the truth. Even vases in the making are uncouth." Barnes, Carew, and Organ, in transgressing the boundaries of both Victorian femininity and what was considered feminine print culture, adopted uncouth positions as poets, artists, and writers. They subjected themselves to daily indignities and probably actual assaults on their womanhood, not to mention showers of molten lead and force feeding. The grotesqueries of courtship, sex, and childbearing nevertheless loomed persistent. It's important to see these women not as individual women within a male-dominated field, but rather as a group of women negotiating the larger cultural space of modernity itself. Okay, that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Let's see, if you stop screen sharing, everyone will be able to see more people. Okay,
There
thank
we
you
are.
for that. Really interesting talk. The floor is open for questions. If you want to use your little blue hand or wave your arms if you can't find the blue hand, and I'll try to see you. I'm going to wait 1 minute, as it always takes a second to warm up. Okay, yes, Jonathan.
So thank you for that fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you specifically if your account could help us understand if there were any substantive distinctions among the three related to questions of sexuality. There seems to be a kind of privileging, obviously very strongly historically grounded, of gender, but not as much attention to questions of sexual difference. And I was hoping you could address that.
Yeah, there actually, thanks for that question. There are some really obvious differences between the three, I would say. I mean, Djuna Barnes is very much, I think, displaying a lesbian sexuality. Marjorie Organ definitely heterosexual. Yeah, Kate Carew was an interesting one because she was older. You know, she was born in 1869, and by the time she became successful, she was in her 40s. And so I left this out of the talk for reasons of space. So I'm really glad you asked this question. But in her later interviews, she actually referred to herself as Aunt Kate, and she kind of like presented herself as like being very different from the stunt girl reporters. Like she had no sex appeal. She had these like glasses. She was this kind of spinsterish figure who nevertheless was interviewing these kind of, you know, romantic actors and things like that. So she was always making fun of herself in that way. But yeah, I think, you know, as I continue this work, it'll be really important to kind of like look at distinctions between these women too.
Jerry, go ahead.
Thank you. This was wonderful, and I guess it's maybe less a question than an observation, and maybe also follows on what you were said, that of the three, if I'm correct, Kate Carew is the only one who does self-portraits in her drawings, at least I think the only ones you showed. And yet her drawings of herself are so stylized and so different from the drawings of others. She really turns herself into a funny cartoon character, where the others are, the figures she's drawing are kind of more elegant and high styled, perhaps. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the self-representation in the drawings of the three women, if it exists or not, and you know what you think is behind it.
Yeah, I don't actually, I don't know when Kate Carew started drawing herself in that way, but by 1910, certainly every single one of her interview features has her in it. You know, it's kind of like Where's Waldo? Like she's always this little tiny figure and then this really larger than life celebrity that she's interviewing. Djuna Barnes actually illustrated herself quite frequently. And it's interesting because she sometimes portrayed herself in this, you know, in the kind of like sort of grotesque amorphous way that she drew the tango dancer and the slide I had with the three figures and the types found in odd corners. But she also, there's one self-portrait, and I think this actually appeared with an interview, depicts herself in this kind of cubist way also. But I think she was very much cognizant of the way that the image of herself played a part in her stunt journalism. And so in her, in the interviews where she portrayed herself in drawings, I think she really tried to present herself as not being glamorous in the way that the newspapers wanted her to appear in that form. Marjorie Organ, I don't know. Her women, you know, the photographs that I've seen of her, she was very much kind of fashioned herself in the mode of the kind of Gibson girl. And those were largely the focus of, or the women that she portrayed in her strips as well.
Thank you.
Djuna, I had a question. I liked how you talked about the physical placement of the comic on the front of the, I forget which page, the sporting page or the local news section, as indicating its genre. And I wonder, could you say more about different kinds of comics and where they appear in newspapers and periodicals? Because these reporters seem to be doing one kind of thing that's like different from like a daily joke strip, you know. Did they have their own section at this time, or were they on a you know, was it like, I'm remembering the funny pages when I was a kid with like a bunch of comics on one opening of a newspaper? Or how did, like, what was the relationship more between comics and newspapers, and how did Djuna Barnes's work kind of, where do you position it in that?
Gosh, I feel like I saw Jared Gardner here. I feel like he should be answering this question, not me. But
you can speak up too.
Yeah, he can fill in all the stuff I leave out. Yeah, I guess you know, the comic strips. I think there's just a huge amount of research to be done on comic strips during this time because it's a genre that's in the process of formation. You know, the Sunday comics, like the and there was Maude, which was in the second slide that I showed. The Sunday comics became pretty rigid by about 1904, 1905, I would say, where you see these kind of like 2-row strips divided into panels. But the sports pages and the features pages and the editorial pages also, I think, remained pretty fluid throughout this time. Like I think there's a whole lot to be done with the sporting page as a place where the comic strip developed. This is actually where I think Jared could probably speak to this more than I can, but you know, there's
everything you're saying is awesomely right.
Yeah, and I think that it would be a great addition to developing this genre, because a lot of the comic strip artists got their start on the sporting pages. And one of the things that really interests me about Barnes is that when you look at her newspaper journalism, all of her work has been kind of like studied in bits and pieces in isolation from where it appeared. But it's really interesting to see her sports coverage appearing in the same section as those drawings, the types from Odd Corners, which have been treated as drawings, but I see them absolutely as comic strips, as comic art, because of how they appeared in the papers. Yeah, another person I'm thinking of is George Harriman, who I've actually done work on. He published cartoons and comic strips and single panel cartoons in all of these different places as well. And so, thinking about these artists not as comic strip artists in the way that we think of the funnies, but as producing a much more varied genre, I think would really enrich our understanding of that history.
Well, Jared has his hand up earlier anyway. So did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it's as Jean, first of all, Jean, that was terrific stuff. I had to miss a little bit, so I'm going to see if I can grab some of the first few minutes from you, but I loved it. And I love Kate Carew, so I was also just excited to see somebody talking about her. I think you're absolutely right? This is, in some ways after 1905, 1906, you start to have the comic supplement, which was really its own thing. It was almost like a periodical within the newspaper. That starts to become fairly rigid. And it's geared a little bit more towards families and younger audiences. Whereas this was for adults. And it bounced around. A lot of it was in the sports pages, but other places too, as you say. And I think it was kind of occupying this interesting space. These people really interacted with the news and with the newsroom in a way that the kind of folks doing strips were not. And it was often the same people, people like, as you said, like Opper and Harriman were doing strips, but they were also doing editorial cartoons and other kinds of things. And they were really built to be in dialogue with the news and the text. And I think that gave it a kind of particularly interesting energy. All that gets regularized eventually too, but this period that you're focusing on here is really exciting. I did want to ask, I was really struck, just kind of picking up from the earlier question, because I was struck by your point about Kate Carew's kind of caricature of herself. And I noticed just looking up some Spanish flu comics for a blog I was working on. I noticed Faye King and a couple of other women cartoonists from this period of the 1910s doing similar things, kind of exaggerating certain features, but making themselves, on one hand, like, as you said, refusing a kind of sexualization, refusing the male gaze. And you can only imagine what it was like working in these incredibly male-dominated, gross newsrooms. But on the other hand, making themselves into recognizable celebrity figures, right? Distilling themselves down into what were in the early 20th century, really our first new media celebrities, the comic strip characters, people like Happy Hooligan and so on, Buster Brown. But before we had movie stars, we had these comics characters. So it's kind of interesting. On one hand, there's a kind of seeming like withdrawal from the gaze. On the other hand, there's a really a kind of celebration of a kind of celebrity in that move that Carew makes. And I wondered if that sounded right to you, or if you think I'm reaching, which I
Well,
do, I admit.
I guess what I would say is what interests me about the female comics artists is that so many of them did not present themselves as celebrities, but became identified with these sort of grotesque babies and children, that those were the characters that
Like with
they
Drayton
became
and
known.
others, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Grace Wiederheim and Rose O'Neill, and Rose O'Neill, even, I think the apocryphal story is that her first husband divorced her because she talked baby talk all the time.
Yeah, it sounds apocryphal.
Yeah, I would love to know, sound history is even more inaccessible than periodical history. But yeah, I mean, and I always I thought Kate Carew's Angel Child was really interesting too, because, you know, it's this yucky baby who's the center of that strip, and she's always like twice the size of the adult figures, and it's almost a reversal of how she portrays herself in the interviews. And
Right.
yeah, I think there's a lot more to do with Carew, but
Yeah.
she's somebody whose strips I've had a hard time finding during this pandemic time.
Yeah, and if you haven't been in touch with Caitlin McGurk, I'll get you her contact information because she's obsessed with Carew and company also.
Awesome.
But great stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Peter, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Jean. And that was great. I'm really intrigued by the experiments with her signature. That the Djuna, she sometimes just puts Djuna, she sometimes puts Djuna Barnes, but she also does these weird descenders that come from the, you know, I don't know where that comes from, that the DJUNA, the J has a descender, but then the A has huge descenders sometimes, and then Barnes too. So I wonder whether, I mean, she's experimenting, it seems, with the signature itself, with her sense of whether she puts both names or whether she puts one name, but also these strange descenders. Is this a feature of Art Nouveau or something, or I mean, are other people doing similar things with their signatures?
Okay, so you've put your finger on like all the new stuff. Like I really have I actually read Djuna Barnes for the first time in order to do the research for this talk, because I came to Djuna Barnes through the periodicals. So, you know, I read Nightwood for the first time over winter break, you know, things like that. I'm embarrassed to admit this. It's like David Lodge humiliation. I just admitted this in front of dozens of people. But yeah, I don't really know about the signatures. I mean, there's certainly an element of the decadent kind of Aubrey Beardsley kind of style, as well as Art Nouveau. Yeah, I can see that in there. But I don't know. I would love to know if any of the modernists in the room would have anything to say about this, or if there are any Barnes scholars in the room. I don't know. Not that many people studying Barnes, I noticed. But yeah, I have no clue, Peter. I'll have to look into that.
She does her full name for the types, right?
Yeah.
Is it only there, Peter? I only noticed it there in the types comic. It's like that gets her full name for some reason.
Well, I think because that was some of the first work she published. It would not make sense, I don't think, for her to not put her full name there. So I think that would be one clue, is looking at when these things were published, you know, when she became known.
But that might be itself a sign of celebrity in itself, you know, the Djuna, just putting the Djuna there as opposed to the Barnes once you become famous enough. But I just interested, I was interested also just in the visuals. The visuals are very striking. And above all, the notion of these descenders that come from the A's rather than, you know, a J obviously has a descender, but these huge descenders. And literally I was trying to, I didn't recognize her name. It's like a game with, is this a signature or not? Is this a name or not? Because obviously it's fairly small on the screen, and it might be, if you're looking at them slightly in larger scale, that it would be more clear what the name is, but I don't know. It's just a sort of, I wonder whether it's part of celebrity itself, in other words, that the kind of the notion of the name, how you're actually inventing the visuals of a name and experimenting with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the images, and the one with the weird descenders that you're describing was actually, that was the one where she was, where the caption said that she was the American Beardsley. And this appeared in Bruno's Weekly, which would have been a little magazine. So I also wonder if this is an indication of her trying to style herself as an avant-garde bohemian intellectual.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Ellen Garvey. You're still muted, Ellen.
There we go. Hi, Jean. So I just remembered that I had heard of this a project to make a documentary film about Carew, and I put the link in the chat. might be worth following up on. But a friend, and I found my old correspondence with a friend who was working on that, and I had come across a reference to her as a playwright, where Elizabeth Jordan, in her book about female journalists, says, she makes this odd remark. She says, "Are you still working on Kate I'm sorry. Do you remember what they said about Miss Carew, that her play was so feminine, she must have done it with crochet needles?" So I don't know what did she write plays? Do you know anything about this?
I
But I'm
have,
curious also about the idea of femininity here, because that's her styling of herself, that little caricature she makes of herself as this little teeny person with a silly hat, you know, diddling around among celebrities, is such an interesting one, and I mean, just her playing with her image in that way is so intriguing as both childlike and super feminine, hyper feminine.
well, and also very kind of prim and proper. But when you actually read what she writes, I mean, she's totally playing smart, right? In the way that Catherine Kieser talks about. And so I think she is kind of playing on this spinstery kind of image, you know, that she would be shocked, you know, easily shocked by the revelations of these people she's interviewing, but she never is, you know? And so I think that's part of her appeal. Yeah, and I did want to just go back to something that Jared was saying too, that people like Kate Carew, I don't know how much contact she would have actually had with like the newspaper staff people on a day-to-day basis. You know, the features that she wrote really appeared in the Sunday magazines, and, you know, appeared as kind of major features that would have not required her to actually engage very much with, you know, like the sports reporters or the copy editors or whatever. And I think that's actually what makes Marjorie Organ so interesting, because she worked in the department doing daily comic strips and cartoons for 4 years. And I cannot imagine how that would have happened. You know, and she was 16 at the time, you know, 16 to 20 years old, working with these really, like, I would just say kind of gross, creepy men who put panties up in the windows instead of curtains, you know? So, yeah, so I would love to see more done with Marjorie Organ. I actually saw there was a comment in the chat asking about whether or not Robert Henry's progressive politics rubbed off on Organ.
I'm sorry, not rubbed off, but if they complemented each other, or just because we're talking about even the male gaze, right? And right, he winds up painting, as far as I know, this is not my field, but right, as far as I know, he paints a portrait of her that does gain some renown, right? So then you do have, right, what part of what you talked about is this inversion of gaze, and then right, that happens, right, because of course he's an artist who is committed to, who's kind of anti-academy and looks to portray oft underrepresented populations. So I'm just wondering if there's any.
Yeah, well, I think well, for one thing, I think he did not see her as damaged goods. You know, I hate to say it like that, but I think he was not bothered by the fact that she was working for the newspapers. And what I think she brought to the relationship, I mean, I think it's sad that she ended up becoming a kind of like partner to Henry, and, you know, managed his schedule, and she served as his model. But she did keep painting. And, you know, and that whole Ashcan group is really interesting, because a lot of the women in that group were painters and very strong personalities. And Edith Glackens is another one who was an accomplished painter and continued to paint all the way through the time that she was married to William Glackens. And I think she and Marjorie Organ were really good friends. So I think there's also quite a bit to be done with the women in that group of painters, that they, you know, they all would paint together, and they would all go out drinking together. And, it was they did theater together. And I think the women in that group, Marjorie Organ in particular, have not been studied enough by art historians.
Thank you.
John, you had a question.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jean. Sorry I was a little late. Wonderful material, and it all new to me. So, but I guess I would just sort of first of all echo a discussion that's been happening. I'm fascinated by this sort of discussion of newspaper culture and the kind of experimentalism that you're seeing there in the way the genre is working. I think that is really something worth playing more with, and the way, particularly in the relationships between image and text. With it is true, we come at it from a world where we think we know where comics and cartoons belong in these forms, and this is clearly not. I mean, it seems both really profoundly different from what I know it's like from the 1890s, a little bit, and it's obviously not something yet recognizable to us. So I just thought that was interesting, for all those reasons. And I guess a question actually to go in a slightly different direction is if you know much yet about Bruno's or Bruno. I wish we were in person, because we actually, as it turns out, have a bunch of these Bruno's chapbooks. I mean, the chapbook thing's interesting because I think it was also being picked up by fine press folks in this period. So it is the sort of Renaissance chapbook thing, but it's also being reinvented by fine press folks, and and that whole arts and crafts movement is they're always doing chapbooks. But it seems like a Greenwich Village thing, Bruno, or there's some Beardsley reprinting going on. There is a Bruno's Weekly, as well as these chapbook series, which also apparently has some Barnes. Anyway, if you know anything yet about what the deal is with that little world, which is kind of a lot to me, maybe complimentary, but rather different than the newspaper sort of zone. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, Bruno was on Washington Square, and he was kind of like a, bohemian impresario, is my sense. And so I see his chapbooks as being very much aligned with the little magazines that were emerging at that time. And yeah, they all kind of took the chapbook and made it modern, right? But I do think that, I would love to look at the book of Repulsive Women, because I'm interested in how it would have been produced in such a way that those 5 drawings would be at the end versus the 8 poems at the beginning. That doesn't really make sense to me unless they're in separate signatures, in which case it would make sense to me. But the book isn't long enough, it seems to me, to warrant multiple sections. And so so I have all these questions about how those were produced. All I had access to was the digital surrogates at University of Maryland, and you can see some stapling, but it's
stapled, yeah.
Yeah, but it's hard to tell where the signatures begin and end. And so, but yeah, I'm really curious to know why it was produced that way.
We have a copy, and I will, and a bunch of these others, as it turns out. I didn't, thanks to you, I now know that, and I will pull them out and we'll have a look.
Yeah, I would love to know. And Ellen actually asked a question about the reproduction of the cartoons, right? Yeah, and I think they were like, weren't they using photostats? I don't know. Jared answered this question.
Yeah, it changes a lot during this time, but it's during this time, I think they're still shipping, they're still basically drawing, reducing them. And then if it's being syndicated, if it's just in one paper, that's easy. But if it's being syndicated like a comic strip, they would often be producing, it has a great name for it. I'm forgetting. Jenny Robb just reminded me of it the other day. It's like Flong. Yes, thank you. And sending, I always start thinking of the Thong song, and sending these paper molds out to be converted into basically, to be converted into lead for printing at the local paper. So it was a kind of cumbersome process with lots of steps of mediation.
Ellen, did you have another question, or is your hand up from the question you put in the chat? Okay, JC, go ahead.
A follow-up from that is sort of that, you know, if you draw something quite large, it can look a lot better when you make it smaller. And I wonder how much reduction would have been done, and you know how much that contributes to the look at it of it. I mean, you can draw something quite sloppily, and then when it's shrunk down, it has a whole different appearance. I'm also curious. I mean, the chapbook might also be that the print part, the text parts would be reproduced, you know, would be typeset, and the pictures would be done in some other method, and that might also account for the different for the clumping of the grouping of the images. But Jared maybe could answer that as also the question about, I mean, if there's any place you could access the original drawings, you might have a very different sense of what any of them were doing.
I know a place. Come to the Billy Ireland. Come visit us in Columbus.
It is worth every minute, I will say. Yeah, I was actually thinking that's the only place I can think of where you have original drawings.
Yeah, and they do vary. I mean, but Ellen, you're absolutely right? I mean, there's, you know, it allowed artists to work very freely and loosely, and then to produce often very tight looking drawings. But the papers were still big, as Jean knows, looking at these things. These pages were still, back in 1910, they were large. So they had a lot of real estate to play with. But Jean, what's your sense looking at originals? My sense is roughly 2-to-1 ratio is often about what, from the original to the image we see. It's pretty standard, but it varies completely.
Yeah, that's what was kind of coming to mind, was that it was about 2-to-1. Yeah.
JC, who has a comic strip behind him. Go ahead.
Yeah, much later comic strip. Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for for this. I came in a little late, and I'm sorry about that. So I work with comics a little bit and teach comics, but mostly later things. But so one of the things I'm interested in thinking about Barnes and what you have to offer here is precisely the how fascinating it is to go earlier than, say, Nightwood, mid 1930s, and there's already kind of this conversation around, or now there is, for years nobody dared to say that the modernist authors were reading comic strips at such a low form, but now it's okay to say that James Joyce was reading Mutt and Jeff and all of these things. So what's fascinating here too is that, so by the 1930s you even have like is it Gasoline Alley, or Frank King has a direct appeal and comment to modernism and all that. But part of what was fascinating in your talk here is one of the things that comes out of Nightwood and Barnes's work, as far as I understand it, is a real interest and fascination with bodies, and often with grotesques, or something that could be described that way in some ways. And so I've never really seen a lot of interesting, a lot of scholarship that kind of pulls this information back into her work as an illustrator, and her interest in both types and bodies, and how you have to distill a type into a certain kind of look in order for it to appear in the newspaper or in satire or in the book of Repulsive Women. And then how does that kind of illustrative visual practice kind of become one of her literary practices? I feel that that's kind of, I know that you recently read Nightwood, but I wonder if that might be kind of a really fruitful way of thinking about how, something she's doing a couple of decades earlier clearly informs her way of looking at, intellectual society, bourgeois society, urban society. How do these kind of types kind of become visual? And then how do you take that and then create this other world? And in Nightwood, you completely have types, kind of that have these kinds of names, that are described as types in many ways. So I don't know, it's not really a question. It just seems like a really super interesting way of kind of putting all of these aspects of what she was about kind of into a dialogue.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think this idea of, I think comics are so often seen as being these as being really reductive, it being very simple, and especially in the early period, they're not. They're really kind of coarse, and they have a lot of kind of organic energy that gets that kind of leaves the form, in my view. Kind of around this time, but yeah. But I think that, like, looking at her, the way she draws, yeah, like I would like to do more in just thinking about her two different styles. She has this very kind of like organic, grotesque style, and then she has this very kind of modern cubist style, and I'm kind of curious to know, like, when she uses one versus the other. But you can see both of those, I think, in textual form in Nightwood. Like sometimes the language is just disgusting, like I'm thinking of Matthew O'Connor when he's like, in his garret, like with all his effluvia and all that stuff. But then Nora Vogt is very much this other very kind of clean, geometric, abstraction, so yeah, I think it would be really cool to actually think about the visual representations and how they intersect with the textual ones. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and there's corpses in both. Like, remember that corpses, and I love that the poems you plucked out about the corpses. That was great.
Well, if no one has a pressing question, then let's thank Jean for a really fascinating talk. Really glad to delve into this world of early American, 20th century American periodicals and comics. It was really interesting, all new stuff for me. So I was really glad to learn about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was fun.